It is my pleasure today, the 25th of March 1988, to interview Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Keith Williamson. Sir Keith's illustrious career began in 1945 when he joined the RAF as an apprentice, and it culminated in his appointment some 37 years later as the Chief of the Air Staff. Sir Keith, may I start the interview by welcoming you most warmly back to Bracknell, and by saying what a pleasure and privilege it is for me to interview you today. What I would like to do, perhaps rather predictably, is just to structure our discussion around your career, starting with that day in February 45 when you enlisted as an aircraft apprentice at RAF Halton. You're the first CAS to have joined the Air Force as an apprentice, and also, I believe, the first CAS since the war to have had no wartime service. Could you tell us something of your motivation for joining the RAF, of your time as an apprentice, and your ambitions at that time?
Gosh, it all happened 40-odd years ago. I think one has to look at it in the perspective of the time. The war was just coming to an end. I had been, I think, 11 years old when the war started, and I had watched the Battle of Britain being fought over London. I was at school in London, and I can't remember a time after the declaration of war when I and all my contemporaries didn't want to be pilots in the Royal Air Force. It was the glamorous thing to do, to be. But towards the end of the war, the flying training system was coming to a grinding halt. They'd got enough pilots, and a lot of cadet pilots were being thrown out of the system and being employed in other directions. A lot of my friends, older friends, this was happening to. They had the coveted white flashes on their forage caps, which said that they were pilots under training, but in fact the training had come to an end, and there was no way of becoming a pilot. And so one or two of us thought, well, we joined the Air Force anyway. That was the short way in, and we'd eventually become pilots. But I don't think we thought about it very, very thoroughly. And it so happened that when I was, I think, 16 and a half, my family was going through a minor crisis, and my father was extremely ill. And I think it was a great relief to my mother and everybody else. This rather awkward teenager decided to go off into a disciplined service. And so I went off initially to Halton, and then trained, of course, at the radio school at Cranwell as a radio fitter. And my ambition was only, at that time, to be a pilot. I didn't actually see the inconsistencies in having 3 years training as a radio fitter to fit me to be a pilot at the time. It just seemed a good idea at the time.
Well, you obviously did very well within your time as an apprentice, because you were chosen to go to Cranwell for a cadetship.
Yes, well, actually, I'm not terribly sure that I did terribly well. I certainly enjoyed it. I mean, I played an enormous amount of sport, and the playing fields of Cranwell, I knew then every inch of them, and I enjoyed it enormously. I don't think I was ever going to be a terribly good radio fitter. But while we were there in the radio school in East Camp at Cranwell, the college at Cranwell, which was always there to be seen by us, of course, this beautiful building, was resurrected as a cadet college. Cadets started arriving, I think, in 1947, and that was a tremendous visible carrot for us to go for. And in fact, on my entry as an apprentice, I think 6 of us got cadetships. 1 went off to Cambridge, and 5 of us went to the college at Cranwell. It was with great relief, I might say, that I left behind the radio fitting, largely because I don't think I'd have been very good at it.
You are a product of the old cadet system. What views do you have on the way we train our officers now, and in particular on the wisdom of doing away with the Cranwell that you knew?
Well, it's actually probably a biased view. I loved my time at Cranwell. I have an enormous amount to owe to Cranwell. I had tremendous respect for the way it was organised, and particularly the people who were organising it at the time, many of whom reached the higher ranks in the service. And I bitterly regret that it's passing. I do understand, of course, the reasons that lay behind the decision, but because in the 1960s particularly, university education was seen by the young to be the be-all and end-all, and I recall that people were getting pretty reluctant to actually sign on the dotted line to stay in a service for a long time. They didn't want to commit themselves. And so we weren't getting the quality of entrant that we required. However, I think there were other and more sensible ways of dealing with that situation. We could have perhaps combined a university entrant scheme with a smaller cadet college and not destroying the cadet
there was
training.
the thought of the degree course at Cranwell.
I don't think actually that was ever really a runner. It was asking far too much of people to take a degree course to absorb the flying training and all the other training that wouldn't easily fit into a degree course that goes hand in hand with the military officers' way of life. And I don't think it was ever really an option, but we could have perhaps increased the number of cadetships to universities while decreasing the size of the college to see which was going to be the better runner. Because by the mid-1970s, the climate in the country had changed completely, and universities weren't all that attractive to the young, and particularly the parents. And if we had a cadet college going now, I believe that we get the right quality of people going through it. But you can destroy at a stroke, but you can't rebuild very easily. And so I bitterly regret it, and I think we've got it wrong. And I can't think of any other major air force in the world that doesn't have some form of cadet college.
Yes, well, as a Cranwellian myself, of course, I agree. It's we've lost that sort of elitist training system.
Yes, and Lord Trenchard, who was, after all, our founder and laid marvellous foundations on which the reputation of the RAF has been built, laid down these three pillars of the Royal Air Force: the apprentice training scheme, the cadet training scheme, and the Staff College training scheme. And two of those pillars have in the past 15, 20 years been substantially destroyed. I think that was a very dangerous thing to do, and I think we'll live to regret both of them.
Well, you were obviously successful at Cranwell, particularly in the flying sphere, because you went on to subsequent flying training and the coveted goal of a fighter cockpit. And the added bonus, of course, of your first tour overseas, when in July 51 you joined number 112 Squadron at Fasberg flying Vampires. Rather like school days, a pilot's first tour is often described as the best of his life. What was life on a Germany fighter squadron like in those days of Cold War and NATO's tripwire strategy? And did you have the right aircraft? And how effectively did you use them?
Well, I absolutely agree with you that the first tour on an operational squadron must be the most marvellous tour of your life, largely because you're shedding the constraints of any training system, and of course you arrive on your new squadron thinking you know it all and are about to prove that you know it all. I mean, it doesn't take long to discover that you know almost absolutely nothing, but the learning process from being a junior pilot on your first squadron, to becoming an expert, an ace, is, I think, very exciting. And it was a particularly exciting time for me, I think for all of us, in the early 50s. You remember, we just recovered from the Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade. Korean War had started, and the Royal Air Force was expanding again after this very sharp contraction that followed the 39-45 war. And so I arrived in Germany at Fasberg onto a station with 4 Kader squadrons. They each had 8 brand new Vampire 5s. We only had 8 pilots, including the squadron commander. And it was absolutely marvellous. The whole of Germany was our low-flying area, and we set about learning the tactical flying that was required of us in the most exhilarating way. Looking back through my logbook, I can see that 5, 6 sorties a day was really quite common. And we, at Fasberg in particular, we had a range within shouting distance of the airfield. So we sharpened up our gunnery and rocketry so that in a very short time we thought we were pretty good. You're having a saying, well, was the Vampire the right aeroplane? Well, it would have been very difficult at that time for any unit to have had the right aeroplane, because the explosion in aviation technology was just starting. Early days, the jet engine, Goblin, which powered the Vampire, was a nice little engine, but it was very quickly superseded by more sophisticated axial flow compressor engines, giving more power. The aerodynamic understanding of aerodynamics was just beginning too, and swept wing aircraft were being mooted. F-86 had first flown in 48, I think. So really, by the time I arrived in Germany in 1951, the Vampire was a very nice, cuddly little toy aeroplane in comparison with the frontline aircraft that were just about to come into service in other air forces. But it was a delight to fly. And I very quickly amassed, I suppose, 500 or 600 hours in it, and I have never felt more comfortable in an aeroplane since. Lovely little cockpit, wooden cockpit. It was absolutely beautiful to fly. No ejection seats, it was very light, lovely to fly. But when you say, was it the right aeroplane? No, certainly not. But then I don't think at that time any Air Force had the right aeroplane.
A little short on nav equipment, I would imagine, knowing the North German smog.
But that, if I might say so, was the understatement of the year. I remember we had a 4-channel VHF set. Of course, one of those channels was the International Distress 117.9. So we really had only 3 usable channels. And our navigation was all done either by DR or VHF DF, vectoring on a little hut on one corner of the Fasberg airfield. And I have to confess that now I can remember in very bad weather on that North German plane having to steer 270 for really rather longer than we should have, bearing in mind that Fasberg was only about 1 minute's flying time from the Iron Curtain.
Yes, you were very close, weren't you, to the border?
So it's quite clear that quite a lot of the time we were flying over eastern Germany. At that time we were there, the Cold War heightened a lot, and there was, I remember Lincoln from Leconfield was doing a border patrol and was shot down with the loss of all lives, and we flew around in our Vampires fully armed, although with guns not cocked, so that we could be ready to fight at the moment's notice. But strangely enough, to a young man, that just heightened the exhilaration of flying. I didn't actually really think very deeply about the international implications that lay behind that decision. Naive, but then I don't think that we want our young fighter pilots on squadrons to be deeply worried about national implications.
Yes, I felt my own young fighter pilots on my squadron had other things to think about, like becoming good fighter pilots. Couldn't agree with you more. Well, you next moved to the Central Gunnery School at Leconfield, where you qualified as an attack instructor. But then I believe you volunteered for service in Korea, and you joined number 77 Squadron RAAF in May 1953, flying Meteors. I've heard less than complimentary things about the Meteors' performance in Korea. Perhaps you would give us your own recollections from your own time there.
Yeah, well, of course, it is exactly the same as the Vampire. The Vampire and Meteor are the same generation of jet aircraft. Very exciting in 1945, but absolutely old hat by 1951. I arrived in Korea right at the end of the war, and the Australians had been operating them for about 2 years. There's no doubt in my mind they should not have been equipped with Meteors, but that's easy to say. And going back to the decision in which that was taken to remove their Mustangs and get them into the jet era, got to understand that the enemy was flying MiG-15s, and clearly you can't combat a MiG-15 with something like a Mustang, versatile airplane though the Mustang was. But at the same time, the Americans were bringing in the F-86 into squadron service, and all that were being produced were needed for the American squadrons in Korea. So there simply were not any jet aircraft available for the Australians apart from the Meteor. But even before they went out to Korea, we knew in the RAF that they were really inadequate for the job, and this was very quickly proved in combat. So gradually the role of the Australians was moved back. First of all, they were doing high-level sweeps. They were shot out of the skies, so they went into close support of other United Nations aircraft, but that was pretty ineffective as well. So they were then relegated to ground attack. And although the Meteors are very robust aircraft and paradoxically quite a good weapon platform for launching its rockets for their strafing, the fact was that the weapon system, the gyro gun sight, required, I remember, us to have 5 seconds continuous tracking of the target before releasing the rockets from about 2,000 feet down to 800 feet, which was just the most lethal range of the enemy anti-aircraft fire. So the Australians lost quite a lot of aircraft in doing even the job that they were relegated to at the very end. And so by the time I got there, frankly, we were being allocated pretty insignificant targets and not terribly well defended targets, for which I was deeply grateful at the time, because I knew that we couldn't actually cope. But it was rather sad. It was pity, because they were jolly good squadron, very, in typically Australian way, very robust and aggressive, but they hadn't got very much to be aggressive about. And while we were there, they were doing trials on providing the Meteor with a bomb that could actually do some damage, as opposed to these 60-pound rocket heads, which were World War II weapons and pretty inaccurate. We also had some napalm heads on our rockets, which were even less accurate than the 60-pound rockets. So all in all, it was a terrible aeroplane, but I suppose it was a gesture from the Commonwealth towards the United Nations forces that the Brits, the Royal Air Force, was unable to contribute to, apart from sending pilots. And there were quite a lot of RAF pilots on the squadron when I was there. Great fun, but I didn't feel that I was hastening the end of the war while I was there.
Yeah. On a sort of wider issue, the employment of air power in Korea, history suggests that our overall contribution was less than decisive. Have you any views on that?
Oh yes, well, if history does suggest that, history is bunk, but we've known that for a long time. decisive, perhaps you're right. Decisive in winning the war, you're right. But decisive in stopping the war from being lost, you're absolutely wrong, because there's no doubt about it. It was air power, and almost air power alone, that stopped the United Nations being utterly overwhelmed in the first year when the North Korean forces, before China joined, North Korean forces hemmed us in down at Pusan corner. It was air alone that stopped defeat then, and it was air alone that prevented the massive Chinese ground forces from flooding South Korea subsequently. And I remember when I was flying over Korea, the one way we knew that we had crossed the 38th parallel, on which approximately the two ground forces were facing each other, was that movement stopped. There was, you could see life as it is in this country now, in South Korea, but as soon as you got in the north, nothing moved, and if anything did move, it was taken out. So all movement of North Korean and Chinese forces happened at night. They were very good at it at night, and we were getting to grips with that, I might say, when the war ended. So there's certainly air power didn't win it, and nobody won it, but it certainly stopped defeat, and was in that sense was decisive.
I certainly think there's a lesson there for our students here at Bracknell when they study history.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But unfortunately, of course, history is in the eye of the beholder, and that is my interpretation, and I think it's an accurate interpretation. But I'm not sure that you get the same view of that episode from ground forces and from naval forces, because we are conditioned by the environment from which we come. And it worries me that people are unable to look dispassionately. I know that I'm unable to look dispassionately at history as close as that. But I believe that was the major lesson of the Korean War, the absolute essential nature of air power. And he who commands the air doesn't lose. He may not win, but he doesn't lose.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, sir. We'll move on now. Next came a tour as ADC to the CNC Home Command, and then in June '56, a welcome return, I'm sure, to flying, and again to Germany, where you flew Hunters with 112 again and with 20 squadrons, the latter as a flight commander. Well, this was a time that Duncan Sandys hatched his notorious white paper. It is hard to imagine now what effect that must have had on the morale of the pilots of the day. Can you give us your own personal recollections of that time on the squadron?
Yes, I have. Actually, it was a terribly sad time. I was on the Bruggen wing by that time. 112 Squadron had moved from Jever down to Bruggen and was equipped with Hunter 4s. There were 4 squadrons of Hunter 4s at Bruggen, and they were all disbanded overnight. And it was actually very morale destroying. I've never seen a unit with morale so low, because we couldn't understand it. We couldn't understand why last week we were seemed to be essential to the workings of NATO, and this week we were no longer required. And of course a lot of people flooded out. And I have to say that if I had not been on a permanent commission and therefore not able to get out easily, I would have gone. A lot of people went into BOAC and BEA, and although that sort of flying had few attractions, one didn't want to belong to an organisation that was seen to be not worth the while. And this picture was reproduced, I think, in every fighter station, because you remember, as a result of Duncan Sand's monstrous white paper, I think that the fighter force in the Royal Air Force was reduced from 55 squadrons, including auxiliary squadrons, to 5. And of course he made those absurd forecasts that we would no longer require manned fighter aircraft beyond the P1. And I mean, I think every forecast that he made has been proved to be utterly wrong. But it was politically expedient at the time because it was post-Suez, and we clearly had got to do some retrenching, and at a stroke Duncan Sands produced the way of doing it. But I think in doing so he did more damage to the ability of this country to defend itself than any single person since, well, I think, Napoleon.
I don't think we need to explore your views any further on that one. So yes, I have to say I find your views very much in line with my own. It's extraordinary, wasn't it? Well, next came CFS, promotion, and 2 tours in the flying instruction business. Staff College followed here at Bracknell, and then your first staff tours in the MOD as PA3E, and then after promotion to Wing Commander, PA1. Most people who've worked in the Air Secretary's Department have enjoyed the job, but in my experience they appear to have been quite hard pressed, and they still are. Did you feel you had the time to give your charges the amount of attention they required in the shaping of their careers when you were in the...
I think that's actually a difficult question to answer, because clearly I think Parkinson's law would apply in the dealing with people more than almost anything else. The work would expand to fill the available time. We were certainly rushed, and I do remember going, when I was in PA3E, going to the continent on holiday for, I think, 10 days, and coming back and having to work every weekend for the next 2 months. And I didn't see my children in that time, and I found it very depressing. Whether the individuals suffered or not from that, you'd have to ask them. I think at that time people were actually less conscious about what they wanted to do. They did less of their own career planning, and that's a thoroughly desirable trend. In my view, people who spend too much time thinking about what the powers are going to be doing to them are wasting their time. They should be getting on with a job. I never, ever questioned in all my career anything that anybody chose to do with me, and by and large, I was pretty satisfied with the way they did it. Having said that, I do remember dealing with one very awkward customer who questioned everything that we did, and this was when I was looking after wing commanders in PA1. And in an exasperated mood, I took his personal file into see my boss, who was a group captain, and I said to him that I thought that a man's career prospects should vary inversely as the thickness of his personal file. And I got a very sharp raspberry and quite rightly so, from my group captain, who told me that it was only really the people with problems that on whom you've got to spend a great deal of time, or one shouldn't resent doing it. In fact, he gave me very strict instructions that should any problems arise, or should anybody want to come and see me, this was before the open door policy was formally set down, then I should make time. And he said to me, if it means you've got to work till midnight, that's tough. See, but it was very busy, and I'm sure it still is.
Yes, you mentioned the open door policy. Do you think it's adapted to the sort of the modern day requirements of the department? Aspirations of the officers today, I think they've changed, haven't they?
Oh, I'm sure they've changed, yes. And I think it is important that they should feel that they have the opportunity to go and discuss their problems. But, you know, rather like giving a horse hay, you can never actually give him quite enough to satisfy the horse. But you can actually give him far too much than is good for him. And I think there's a balance to be drawn in the way one bends over backwards. We are a military service after all, and one's got to reach the stage where if one is told to go, one goes, and not spend too much time arguing about it.
I always felt the open door perhaps was counterproductive in a way in that it made the desk officer's job more busy.
Yes.
It could have been avoided.
Yes, well, there's no doubt about that. But there's got to draw the balance between ensuring that the individuals feel that they are, in fact, getting individual treatment, but not allowing them to dictate what is done to them. Because one of the worst judges of your or my abilities to do a particular job is you or me. I mean, other people can tell me. And the Air Secretary's Department, in my day, did have a very comprehensive dockets on everybody, and by and large, they were pretty accurate. When I left Staff College to go up to the Air Secretary's Department, I was, I think, one of the biggest and most vociferous critics of the system, but it only took me 3 or 4 months to see how it worked and to realise that I couldn't devise a better system, a fairer system. That I became enmeshed with the aims of the Air Secretary's Department, and I have been a great supporter of it ever since.
Well, if we can move on, sir, your next appointment was obviously very special to you. It was command of 23 Squadron at Lucas, which of course is when we first met, flying the Lightning. Do you have any particular recollections or hints to pass on to those who might be similarly privileged to command their own squadrons in the future?
Gosh, I think I would never ever attempt to pass on any hints to anybody, particularly for a job like that, because we all do the jobs in different ways, and who's to say one is the best way and one is the worst? All I can say is that the tour as a squadron commander is undoubtedly the most satisfying and by and large the most enjoyable, notwithstanding what I said earlier about the first tour. It's certainly the most satisfying tour of one's service career. And I felt immensely grateful for having been sent by the Air Secretary's Department and having had nothing whatsoever to do with that, my appointment, to that job. On paper, I had been away from fighter operations some time. I've been in the instructing business, and the further you get away from the front line, the more difficult it is to get back. And I was absolutely delighted to get back. I was absolutely delighted to go to Lucas, and I was absolutely delighted to be flying the Lightning at that time. As you know, it's a super airplane to fly. I mean, it's not the world's greatest weapon system, certainly in the context of the 1980s, but in the 1960s it was sharp, and one felt that one was part of the elite, and there's nothing more comfortable than being part of the elite. I know elitism is a dirty word in this modern society, but if you're part of it, it's very comfortable, and I loved it. Having said that, of course, I wasn't quite sure what we were doing, because Duncan Sands had said there was no need for us, and I think we had 3 roles initially. The peacetime policing role was really the most relevant one. We had peacetime policing role, the air defence of our nuclear assets, but Duncan Sands had already told us we couldn't defend those, so I didn't know what we were doing there, and overseas reinforcement. Well, overseas reinforcement, that in those days was to either Cyprus or the Far East, and so that was interesting, and we used to go, as you remember, to Cyprus on our detachments. Marvellous opportunity to get to know the squadron, and a super flying environment in Cyprus. It was an absolutely marvellous tour, and I suppose the only piece of advice I can give to anybody going onto a job like that is to make the most of it.
Couldn't agree with you more, sir. It's fabulous, yes. Commanding a squadron, it must be something that's quite unforgettable. Well, you obviously had a good tour. You won the Dacre Trophy, I see. And with the summer of '68 came promotion to Group Captain, the award of the AFC, and command of RAF Gutersloh. Now, here was a busy station by any standards, with 2 Hunter Recce squadrons, 2 Lightning squadrons, and from 1970 a helicopter squadron and 26 Squadron RAF regiment. This was the time, I believe, that flexible response replaced the tripwire strategy, and we also saw the birth of Tachyval. Both events must have had a profound effect on the training for war of your station. Can you give us your own recollections of the way Gütersloh responded to these new challenges?
Yes, they're all actually historically combined, because it was in late 1967 when the tripwire concept was thrown to the winds by the politicians, and we turned to the philosophy of the flexibility in response. And that laid greater emphasis on conventional defence, and that gave rise to the tactical evaluation system, which was really an extension of what was already going on in the American stations.
The Orpival system.
Yes, yes. But it was brought home to me very sharply when I arrived at Gütersloh that politicians can change philosophies overnight, but they find it very much more difficult to provide the wherewithal to give validity to their new philosophy. So suddenly the tripwire concept was thrown overboard, and conventional defence was the okay thing, but we didn't have anything, any hardware with which to implement that conventional defence. Ground defences, for instance, were very vulnerable, particularly at Gütersloh, which was only 60-odd miles from the border. So we had to do a lot of ad hocery.
Hence, of course, the return of 26 Squadron RAF regiment.
Well, that's right, yes. Eventually. It takes time, of course. Yes, and the return of 18 Squadron Helicopter Squadron. When I first arrived at Gütersloh, the helicopter squadron had a detachment from Accrington in the UK. They had been at Gütersloh, they withdrew to Accrington, then they came out again 3 years later. We had a lot of ad hocery in trying to improve our conventional capability, and sandbags and barbed wire appeared, and we dug holes all over the airfield. I felt at the time that this was important, really, to get across to the people on the station that things had changed, and we meant business in the defence of the airfield. But at the same time, I also felt there was a bit Dad's Army-ish. There we were, each squadron digging its own hole from which to operate its aircraft, even though they weren't in hardened shelters, they were vulnerable to attack from the air. So it was really psychological rather than actually giving meat to our defensive capability. And there's no doubt that the Tachyval system was valuable in that, and in putting pressure on the individual nations to provide the means for giving validity to the new philosophy of flexibility in response. I mean, at that time, SACEUR's physical protection program had been published, and to qualify for the infrastructure funds that were clearly needed for aircraft shelters, for instance, one had to provide some means, some visible means of defending the airfield from attack from the air, and that's why 26 Squadron came back. I do believe that if the Tachyval system had not existed, 26 Squadron would never have arrived. It put pressure on nations to spend money to improve our defences, and to that extent it was a very good thing. There are dangers in the Tachyval system. It can go overboard. We're always trying to extract a little more from stations, and the realism can get...
The one syndrome.
That's absolutely right, and that's very dangerous. However, it's almost impossible to eradicate. While I was a station commander, I would have resented anybody coming onto my station and giving me anything less than one. squadrons. Well, I was there for the air defence squadrons, and the hunter squadrons, the recce squadrons were phasing out anyway, so they got less than that, but there were good reasons for it. So it's very difficult, and I think it's up to the commanders, Commander-in-Chief particularly, to leaven the intensity of the examinations so that they are sensible. And I think we can do that. But I am a great believer in the tachyval system, and I think as a result of the tachyval system, the air forces in NATO are very much better prepared for war than either the armies or the navies.
Well, I'll move on, if I may, sir, to your first major Ministry of Defence staff appointment, because on completion of that tour you were promoted to Air Commodore and posted to the MOD as Director of Air Staff Plans. Now, this was a period when major re-equipment programmes were bearing fruit. Harrier, Nimrod, Puma programmes were complete, of course. Jaguar and Rapers introduced, Phantoms changing to the AD role, Shackleton's earmarked for AEW. But then in 1974 came the Defence Review, and with it a planned 18% cut in manpower, the closure of 12 airfields, disbandment of NEAF, large cuts in the transport and maritime forces, and cancellation of the medium-lift helicopter for the Army. Frankly, a substantial reverse, I think it will be looked upon. But Tornado appears to have survived unscathed in both the IDS and the ADV forms. Can you give us your own recollections of the Defence Review, and in particular, how well the RAF fought its own corner?
Yes, the Defence Review was very dramatic, and in making an assessment of how well we fought our corner, one has to understand the priorities at the time. And there's no doubt about it, the major priority, all the time I was Director of Air Plans, was in defending the long-term proposals for the re-equipment of almost our entire front line with the Tornado. And there were many, many people sitting on the touchline who would have liked to have gone at that programme because it represented a major tranche of money that could have been reallocated to relieve pressures in other directions. So we didn't get any help from the Army or the Navy. They wanted the Tornado programme to go, and they wanted some of the fallout from it. So to that extent, we fought our corner jolly well. We won. I must say we were helped a great deal by the fact that the Tornado was a multinational programme, and at a time when Dennis Healy was preparing to go to cap in hand to the IMF, we needed all the international friends that we could get. And so to that extent, we were helped by the international implications that any foreclosure on the Tornado programme would have had. But nevertheless, we had to fight it in Whitehall as well. And there were a number of other, I think, very sensitive issues that were raised at the same time, inter-service issues raised at the same time. The proposals that the Navy had for their, what we call the see-through carriers, and the introduction of the Sea Harrier, which very controversial, a reversal of policy decisions taken as a result of the end of the Ark Royal in the late 60s. So that it was actually a very difficult time. And at the same, overall that, of course, was this massive cutback in people. And the
yes, I think that was something that I certainly recall, because I was in the MOD at the same time, as being one of the less palatable aspects of the review, the compulsory redundancy scheme to cut back the people. Was that really necessary?
Well, I think in the context of the number of people that we've got to get rid of, it probably was necessary. In the intellectual arguments for a compulsory redundancy scheme rather than a voluntary redundancy scheme were, I think, unarguable, because the pyramid had was misshapen. We had a misshapen for a number of reasons, most of them historical reasons. The fact that we were now all going to serve until we were 55, which meant that in the old days the squadron leaders used to go out at the age of 43 and the wing commanders at 47. So the pyramid was always kept in a sensible shape. But we did have at that time a substantial proportion of jolly good, well qualified, very experienced mill rank officers for whom we were not going to have jobs. Having said that, though, if you go to a compulsory redundancy scheme, you change the whole atmosphere in the service that you've served in. I was brought up to, we don't have unions. Nobody looks after us. Nobody looks after our pay claims, our conditions of service claims, apart from our masters in Whitehall who do it for us. And for all the time I had been in the service, they had done it pretty well. Better sometimes than others, of course, but that's inevitable, but they'd done it pretty well. And then suddenly, in 1974, we said to a whole bunch of very loyal chaps, we don't want you anymore. And the effect that had on the rest of us remaining in the service was dramatic. It's understandable. People were saying, well, if you're not going to look after us, we'll have to look after ourselves. And selfishness, understandable selfishness, became prominent in the people's psyche. It'll take a very long time for that to go away. So I do understand why there was a redundancy program, a compulsory redundancy program. I regret it very much, and I think that at a stroke it changed the service for life, forever.
Briefly, did you feel that your own personal experience of MOD, or lack of personal experience of MOD, had any effect on the way you were able to carry out your duties of the air plans?
Oh, yes, I think...
You hadn't cut your teeth, of course.
No.
No.
Although when I had been at the industrial house, I had seen what was going on. Yes, of course it's a disadvantage. I mean, if you're doing something that you have not seen before, it makes it more difficult. But I've always believed that it's not the experience of people that counts, it's their ability. I've never argued with the Air Secretary's department when they proposed that people should come and work for me and they'll say, well, he's been doing the wrong things. I've always been much more interested in is he the right quality of chap? And I don't believe that I would have been able to do, after the first 2 or 3 months in the Director of Air Plans, that job any better if I'd been immersed in Whitehall as a squadron leader or a wing commander. I do think that it would be very difficult to go in at any higher than a 1-star level without knowing the machinery, experiencing the machinery. And I do understand that there is a very good argument for doing what I think the Navy tends to do now, and that's 1 tour in and 1 tour out, 1 tour in Whitehall and 1 tour out. But you can't do that with people who are flying, who they need continuity, you can't have a squadron commander who doesn't know how to run a flight and doesn't know the detailed daily operations of the aircraft he's flying. So it's not practical politics. Having said that, I do believe that you've got to select your Whitehall warriors from that stage on and make sure that they do return.
Well, in July '75, you left that appointment, and with promotion, you came here to Bracknell as commandant. What changes did you make to the staff training system, and do you feel that what we have now, the present progressive challenge, properly meets the needs of today's and indeed tomorrow's Royal Air Force?
Well, I think actually it's a Freudian question you asked. You say, what changes did you make? This is the, I think, rather sad assumption that when you're new into the job, you must change something. And bearing in mind that by and large we do 2.5-year tours, it means that everything, every 2.5 years is going to be turned upside down. And that has never been the way I've approached any job. What I think one should do is see if a case can be made for changing something, and then change it. But if a case cannot be made for changing something, then you have made a case for not changing it. But having said that, when I came here, we were in the 6-month course, and that, in my view, in educational terms, is a nonsense. We were required to take people from the operational end, well, right across the spectrum of the RAF, bring them here, make sure that they knew how to write properly, not an easy thing to do. I was a great critic of the ISS when I first came here. I didn't really think that it was necessary, and thought that we were getting something for nothing out of our troops, and felt that a flight commander on a squadron was busy enough without worrying about doing some correspondence course that I was told absorbed an enormous amount of time. However, when I got here, and I went down to the ISS and told them of my views, and they rather skeptically looked at me and then took me aside and showed me the solutions that were coming in to the problems that they were setting for their students. I realized that there was a very great need for people to be taught how to write concise, clear, logical English. And then, having done that, having satisfied you can write, they can write, so that they can be at least reasonably prepared to communicate in Whitehall terms. You've then got to situate them in the world they actually live in, the political world, the economic world, and the military world. And you can't do that in 6 months. And so I set about, determined to make the case for changing it to a year's course. There were difficulties in doing this because there were a lot of people who would have liked to abolish Bracknell completely, because it represented a fair investment that could be used elsewhere at a time when we were very short of money. And it could relieve the pressure on people as well, because it would provide, at that time, I think 56 more bodies to be distributed around the Air Force. But I knew that at the time I had a great ally in court as the AMP of the day, who was Neil Cameron, who had been on the DS here and was a great believer in education, certainly at the higher education stages for officers. And I also knew that his successor at that time was going to be the next AMP, who was also on my side. So together we got together and prepared the case. And I knew that provided I could satisfy AMP, then the case would go through the Air Force Board without any difficulty.
And it stood the test of time.
It did. But of course I knew that we couldn't go. It was no good my saying we must go for a year's course, because that was too indigestible leap. So I decided we'd make the case for notch by notch increase, start at 9 months, and lay down the syllabus that would comfortably fill 9 months, and that's what we did. And it's gone on from there, I'm glad to say, notch by notch.
I didn't realise that, actually. I thought you'd gone straight for what we have now. Yeah, well, yes, we're now up to 10 months, and I think that's about right. And it certainly stood the test of time anyway.
Yes, I mean, the 10-month course is virtually a year's course, allowing for gaps between the end of the course and the start of a new course. And of course, one of the means that we achieved that without having a massive increase in manpower actually here is by making sure that there was a gap so that the existing DS could be involved in the formulation of the progression of the exercises that were set, and making sure the syllabus was kept up to date. And I'm very pleased that it's gone as it has. But I'm not convinced that there are not lots of people outside, particularly people who either haven't been here or didn't enjoy their time here, would not be prepared to take the savings and rush away again. I think we must defend this very important pillar, and whether it actually fits service officers for the jobs they're going to subsequently, it's a very difficult question to answer. How many people have you have on the course now? 72?
Yes.
You need to have 72 separate courses if you're going to guarantee that the graduates of this college are ideally suited for the jobs to which they're going. As long as you've given them a reasonable basis, foundation on standards, set the standards. Standards in staff work, standards in thinking, standards in talking. I think you've done a good job. And of course, the competition now to get here is so high, it means that you have a bunch of very sharp chaps who are able to make the most of the opportunities that are given them in a way that perhaps when I came here in 1962 was not true. I mean, everybody went to Staff College. It was inconceivable that any officer worth his while would not come to Staff College, but it's not true now.
I don't think anybody who comes here now is going to sit back and take a ride, that's for sure. Well, sir, if we may move on, next came a tour at SHAPE as Assistant Chief of Staff Plans and Policy Division, and then not a very long tour there because you were promoted, and in August 78 you became AOC and Sea Support Command. It was a time of significant change. The Hawk replaced the Gnat, and the Hunter, of course. Church Fenton reopened as a BFTS. IOT was concentrated at Cranwell. Uniter was introduced, and airman training was extended and improved, the whole airman concept being brought in there. It was also a time of difficulty, I recall, particularly in the spheres of recruiting and retention. And as a result, we faced a shortage of junior officer pilots. Well, this was your first experience of command at a very high level. Could you give us some idea of your task and whether your lack of command experience at group level was a hindrance?
Well, if I could get rid of the lack of command at group level, I don't think it makes a damn bit of difference whether people have commanded groups or not. I think the command function that really matters in the service is at the station level. Thereafter, command of larger formations is frankly largely a matter of getting an administration right, and that doesn't require experience at any particular level. Of course, you've got to impose your personality, but then you learn how to do that at the station level. It was a difficult time, and it particularly difficult from the officer training intake point of view. I was very disturbed to go around the flying training schools and discover, first of all, that the QFIs, many of the QFIs, we had some very good ones, of course, but at that time, many of the QFIs were failed co-pilots who had never actually been recommended for captaincy courses. An awful lot of them were on the list to leave the service. They wanted to leave the service, weren't being allowed to leave the service, so we sent off on a CFS course to go and train the youngsters. It's appalling. There was almost no alternative at the time. I understand how we arrived at that situation, but one doesn't have to be satisfied about it. When I trained, when I was at Cranwell, the flying instructors and the college staff were hand-picked chaps from the war. First class, the best, the cream that the Royal Air Force have got. And I'm afraid I found in training command, or in support command, the training bit of support command, we had a great deal of the ullage. And of course this would have imposed its feelings on the students of any calibre, but at the same time we were scraping the bottom of the recruiting barrel, and so we had some pretty terrible recruits as well. So the future of the service looked very bleak, I have to say, at that time.
What you're saying suggests that that programme fighter pilot was perhaps...
Well, actually, very interesting your mention that, because when I arrived at Brampton, the arrangements for that film had already been set in train. It had been agreed that it would be made. And I did meet the producer and got to know him very well. And I know that when it was shown, it got a very dusty reception from those of us within the service because we felt tainted by it. However, I have to say that when you look in a mirror and you don't like the image, you don't blame the mirror. And that was absolutely reflecting the situation as it was in the training units and support command when I took over. It's no good complaining about it. We had to make the best of it. And of course some of those chaps who were going through the training system at that time turned out eventually to be very good, and they're leading lights on our squadrons now. But many of them fell by the wayside, largely because they simply weren't good enough.
Yeah. Well, a change of government, a change of...
Oh, made it dramatic. Of course, this was at a time when pay was very low. Our standing in the country was very low. The government denigrated defence per se, and so those of us in the defence business felt not wanted. And this communicates itself very quickly from top to bottom, and it manifested itself very clearly on those training units. In my time at Brampton, through no fault of mine, but things changed. But it's a great pity when you've got people who don't want to remain in the service, that you are forced to employ them teaching those people who are just coming into the service.
Yes, it's obviously not a good way to go about it, is it, at all? One of the things that I recall was introduced in your time was TACAVANing within support command. It obviously served its purpose, but it also placed added pressure on a system which was already under pressure to try and overcome the junior officer pilot shortage. Do you feel in retrospect that this was the right move?
Well, the proposals were already on the table when I arrived, and I had misgivings about it because, of course, the half of support command that looked after the maintenance supply and engineering organisation were actually geared to producing. They were manned to produce aircraft at Abingdon, and any diversion from that just compounded the difficulties of meeting the targets and making sure the front line got their aircraft on time. So I had misgivings about it. However, strangely enough, it was the large civilian element within the command who were enthusiastic about it. They felt almost for the first time that they were being drawn in into the sharp end of the Royal Air Force. I remember going to Sealand, which had at that time about 50% civilian manning and 50% service. The civilian supervisors were very enthusiastic about not being left out of it. There were, of course, pay difficulties involving them in it, because they were all on productivity bonuses, and anything that interrupted their productivity bonuses would cost them money, but nevertheless they still wanted to join in. So I have mixed feelings. I think looking back now, I wouldn't do it again. I think it was it was a psychological boost at a time when morale was pretty low, and we were trying to get as much out of our producers as we possibly could, and we were actually putting a difficulty in their way.
I remember personally, in fact, the quandary over where we were going to allow the barbed wire to go to at Cranwell.
Well, yes. No,
We
yes.
had to sort of try and keep it clear of the college surrounds and things like this.
Well, I think that's very important. When I went back to Cranwell as CAS and still saw the remnants of their barbed wire and sandbags, I did ask them to take it away. It has no place really. It has no relevance. But at that time, I have to say, morale was low. You had to feed it somehow to get across to the people throughout the whole of the Air Force what the Air Force was about. Yeah. And so it had its place.
Well, sir, another promotion, and in September 80, you took command of Strike Command. The most significant happening during your command was obviously the Falklands War, but there were many other events of note: the combining of numbers 1 and 38 groups, the introduction of Tornado IDS and Chinook, run-on of the Buccaneers in the maritime strike attack role, and wide-ranging improvements in the UK's air defences, including the enhancement of the F4 and Squadron run-ons, the formation of the Reserve Lightning Squadron, and the arming of the Hawks with AIM-9, and of course the wide-ranging IUCAG improvements. Clearly your experience of command at Support Command stood you in excellent stead here when you moved on to Strike Command, but the command of such a large organisation must have been a trifle daunting nevertheless. Can you give us some idea of your thoughts at the time and of any plans you had for improvements or change? Not trying to be Freudian again.
No, it's certainly not change, but when I did arrive, we knew, of course, that the Balkans were going to be phased out in the very near future. In fact, they got a slight lease of life over the Falklands, but they left soon after the Falklands War ended. And it was clearly there was an opportunity to rationalise the command structure, which was difficult to understand if you didn't look at it in the context of the history and the way it had grown up. I mean, the group's system were really just a distillation of the old command system, where Coastal Command, Fighter Command, Bomb Command all had their own operational roles to perform, and eventually they were absorbed within Strike Command. But with the heavy group, the Balkans being replaced by Tornadoes, a quite different kettle of fish, we did have a look and see whether there was an opportunity to make some financial savings and manpower savings in getting rid of a group. We didn't approach it with the messianic zeal that we were going to get rid of a group, but just, is it sensible now? And we decided, yes, it would be sensible to combine all the tactical operations down at Uphaven with one group that is now, but it was then where 38 group was. And at the same time, put the maritime aircraft all under the operational control of the commander, the AOC 18 group, which made a lot of sense. So I put up proposals to the Air Force Board that this should happen, and of course it did happen just as I was leaving the command. The introduction of the Tornado, of course, went very smoothly, and in fact all the plans had been laid a long time before I arrived, and I cannot believe that we've ever had an aircraft that was so complex, that came in with so few teething problems.
Could you say the same of IUCAG? You were obviously involved to some extent.
I was extremely cross about the way, I had been, even when I did our plans, about the way the UCAG had been set up. I believe that we ought to have, on a major program like that, we ought to have one program controller who carries a can and has the financial authority to ensure that this implementation comes in on time at every aspect, at every level. It was clear all through my time at Strike Command there was no such control being exercised by those responsible within the procurement executive, because they were structured in a way that made it impossible. They were vertical structures that didn't speak to each other, and so there was infinite scope for things to go wrong. And although we formed a team, as a result of my worries, we formed a team down at Strike Command to sort of sit and ride shotgun on what was being done. They had no power. They had power to advise me, and that just meant I had to put on my boxing gloves and go and try to sort them out, but it found it almost impossible to do.
So it was more or less troubleshooting rather than management?
It wasn't even troubleshooting, because troubleshooting implies that you have the power to put things right, and we didn't. We had only the power to blow the referee's whistle, but we had no authority. We hadn't got the authority of the referee to say, award a penalty or to declare time. So it was a desperately complex program that was bound to go wrong, and it has gone wrong.
Yes, well, it's disturbing to hear that. Obviously, as an air defender, one sets so much store by the new system and everything it promised. It's disturbing.
Yes, I think it's the implementation of the program that has gone wrong. I'm not suggesting that the design of the program is wrong, or that the equipment itself, once it's installed and up and running, will not be right. But with an air defence system, as you well know, you can't say, well, we'll have a moratorium on air defence for the next 2 or 3 years while we put in a new system. It's got to be up and running while you're defending, and therefore requires very, very close mating of every aspect at every level, works and bricks, and as well as electronics. And the chap who is actually responsible for air defence structurally has no say in the way they're going about doing it. And I think that is potty. I'm a great believer in the Admiral Rickover principle, that when the United States Navy had a nuclear submarine program, they appointed an admiral who had the power, the authority, the financial authority, and carried the can. And there's nothing that sharpens efficiency more quickly and more effectively than having to carry the responsibility when things go wrong. But you can't do that unless you have all the authority. And there's nobody at Strike Command, or even in the Air Force Department in Whitehall, who had the authority to put any of these things wrong. We knew perfectly well that holes in the ground were not being prepared at the right speed, right time. We knew that electronic equipment was not going to come in at the right time scale in the right place. But all we could do is say, please, have you thought of this? And these watertight compartments in procurement executive weren't speaking to each other. Terrible.
Moving on now, so another important event, as we've already mentioned, was the Falklands campaign while you were in command. It appeared to an outsider that the chain of command ran direct from the MOD to northward, and that AOC 18 Group was the RAF's operational voice. What was the exact relationship between command and group during the campaign?
I mean, it's absolutely right. When the Falklands War started, the Navy really wanted it all to themselves, and it was only reluctantly did they recognise that the Army and the Air Force had a part to play, which is unfortunate. But of course, because the AOC 18 Group was embedded in Northwood, he was obviously the man to act as advisor to Sink Fleet, who was controlling the operation. In the very early stages, it became obvious that what was needed was a formal appointment for the AOC 18 Group within the context of the Falkland War, and I took the initiative and got on to CAS at the time and asked him if he could get the Chiefs of Staff to appoint AOC 18 Group as the Air Commander. There was a bit of shilly-shallying about the precise words, and I can't remember precisely what he was called. I don't think he was actually called the Air Commander because of sensitivities the Navy had over who was going to be commanding the Sea Harriers down on the carriers. But however, to all intents and purposes, as far as the Royal Air Force was concerned, the Royal Air Force's contribution to the Falklands operation, AOC 18 Group was in control, in command, and responsible direct to Sink Fleet. I saw my role as advisor to AOC 18 Group, making sure that he had all the physical requirements that he felt he needed, advising him on the capabilities of our aircraft, suggesting, but never telling, what our contribution might or might not be, and making sure that the whole of Strike Command's effort was geared to providing him with what he needed. And it worked very well. I used to go down to Northwood very regularly and see both Air Marshal Curtis and Admiral Fieldhouse to make sure that they felt that we were doing all we could. Of course, we did retain command of things like the Hercules fleet, but they were controlled by AOC 18 Group when they were done from the Ascension onwards. And it worked extremely well.
It clearly did work well to those of us who are in the know, but very briefly, I wonder if you'd like to place on record how well you thought it worked, despite the fact that the public perception is that it was a Navy
yes.
show. The Navy are very keen to say that it was a Navy show. I really feel our own particular praises were rather undersung.
Muted, yes. Muted. Yes. You're absolutely right. The fact is, of course, that I think the major lesson from the Falklands War, in much the same way as the major lesson from the Korean War, was that air power was decisive. It's absolutely essential. The fleet could not have got down to the Falklands without constant resupply from us via Ascension. They could not have won the war in the way they did, and one has to face it that they were actually very lucky that one of those carriers wasn't sunk. Very lucky indeed. Luck and good management, of course, go hand in hand, but so the major lesson from the war is that the essential command of the air prevents defeat. Exactly the same as in every war since aeroplanes first appeared over the battlefield of Flanders. You're right that we were muted. I was very keen that we should adopt a very low key, because certainly as far as the Vulcan activities were concerned, we wanted the Argentinians to believe that we had the capability of doing more than we actually had the capability of doing. In attacking the airfield at Port Stanley on that first real strike against the Argentinians, we were showing the Argentinians that we had the reach to strike against Argentina. The fact that it was going to be politically unacceptable got nothing to do with it. They were required, therefore, to redeploy quite a number of their fighter assets to prevent us from doing something that we had no intention of doing, but had demonstrated we had the capability of doing. So that, to that extent, it helped the war effort. But if we had actually told the real story of how that first Vulcan got down there, and the effort that it took, and the fact that we could only do it, mount that sort of exercise at the expense of almost everything else that was going on, it would have undermined that case, and they would have realised that we were actually very vulnerable. The Navy, of course, were very sensitive about us getting into the limelight at all, and one has to accept that one, in the middle of a war, one doesn't want to start raising inter-service rivalries. The last thing one wanted to do, although they didn't hesitate to raise them. But we don't want to join in that sort of battle. I felt that, I think, when I still feel that when the true story of the Falklands War is told, and it's much too close to it at the moment, that it will reveal substantial mismanagement of the air assets down on the island. And I think it's very relevant that when we first bombed the island, our major intention was to put one bomb on the runway, and that's what we achieved. But I, as CNC Strike Command, didn't know whether we had succeeded for about 10 days, and then I saw a photograph in a newspaper, which was the first reconnaissance photograph I had seen. Now, in any sensible organization or operation, you do your damage, and you want to know what damage you've achieved to know whether you've got to mount another attack straight away. And so we had assumed, and the commander on Hermes had been asked to arrange for dawn reconnaissance. But instead, at dawn, the Sea Harriers went and beat up the airfield, and we didn't have any photographs. I mean, there are a lot of these. There was a lack of understanding of what they were doing, frankly, in spite of the fact that the air defence activities were not badly done. Whether they would have been done as well if they hadn't got the AIM-9L, because most of them were fired visually rather than using the radar. I don't know, but that was reasonably well done. But the application of subsequent application of air power was badly done. I remember speaking to the 2IC of 2 Para when he got back. He was actually on a course at Greenwich, on the Senior Officers' War Course, I think it was, and I went across there to lecture, and he came up to me afterwards, and he said he thought I ought to know that it was in his opinion, and I don't suppose there's anyone in a better position to have an opinion about it, that after Colonel Jones had been killed, and they began negotiating for the surrender of the Argentinian troops at Goose Green, it was the arrival of the Harriers dropping cluster bombs that sealed the deal.
That was one squadron.
One squadron, absolutely, yes. He said it was not so much what they did, but what they appeared to the Argentinians to be capable of doing. And he said that after that strike, they came and surrendered straight away. Otherwise, they might have been facing a very bloody battle. Well, that one squadron could have been used much more effectively.
I would love to go on to talk more about the Falklands War, sir, but I'm afraid time presses. So we must move on to the pinnacle of your career, of course, the appointment to the highest office within your service, that of Chief of the Air Staff. What were your thoughts when this great honour and responsibility came your way?
What were my thoughts? Well, I suppose the main one, my God, haven't they got anybody better than me? But because I went out there at a very, very good time for all 3 services, and the Falklands War had just been won, and the services were good news to the country. I knew, we all knew, that would last almost as long as an English summer, but nevertheless, we had to make hay while the sun shone. And so we set about very quickly recouping the losses that we'd suffered through the Falklands, and that was very quickly done. For the Harrier replacements and the Chinooks that we lost came very quickly, and we didn't have to make much of a case for the TriStar tankers because the importance of the tanker force had been dramatically emphasized. So procurement became very easy, and there was money, but the English summer was shorter than usual.
Yes, well, of course, it came to I suppose, an abrupt end with Mr. Heseltine and his reorganisation.
Oh, yes, yes.
No doubt you have some personal views on the way that was pushed through.
Yes, well, I have, and they are strictly personal views. The reorganisation had absolutely nothing to do with defence or the higher management of defence. It had much more to do with Mr. Michael Heseltine's personal career, and I found that actually, and I still do, deeply offensive. I resisted the reorganisation, not because I thought that the way we were organised was the best and the only way of organising ourselves, but because I felt that the strengthening of the centre that Michael Heseltine was pushing on us was naive and destined never to work. I've always believed that he who tenders advice should have the responsibility for carrying out that advice. I believe that, for instance, when the Prime Minister said to the Chiefs of Staff, what can we do about the Falklands, the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands? It was only the Chief of Naval Staff who could say whether a fleet could sail, because he had the responsibility for sailing it. Nobody else could. And it was removing at a stroke, the Heseltine reorganisation, that degree of professional responsibility that I feel is essential, particularly when you're dealing with men's lives and the important business of going to war. So I don't think it can possibly work. It will work in peacetime, of course, but the real dangers will come in wartime.
In war.
And it did at the same time give enormously increased powers to the civil service, so that the second PUS assumed really almost supremo powers over all three services, shape and size of the three services. Now, initially, that's fine. We knew the second PUS, he got on well with us, and there's no difficulties. But I'm thinking in 10 years' time, when the personalities have gone, and if you give power to people, it's inevitable that it will be used. And I don't want the shape, size, or even the style of the Royal Air Force to be dictated by anybody else other than Royal Air Force people.
What were the views of the other chiefs?
Well, it's quite difficult to say, because I certainly, the Chief of General Staff was absolutely on my side, and we opposed wholeheartedly. Chief of Defence Staff, of course, I think was much attracted to his increased powers that he had, and I think he genuinely believed that he had the experience and wisdom to be able to arbitrate between the requirements of the three services. And the Chief of Naval Staff was by then going to be the next Chief of Defence Staff, so the same applied to him to a certain extent. So we were split, and which is a great pity, because I think if we had been more robust and together, we could have ameliorated the damage that Michael Heseltine has done. But of course, having split, you can be carved up, and we had absolutely no power. We marched across to see the Prime Minister, but understandably she supported her minister. I think it was played, actually, that we could have played the defence in a more dirty way, and I wish we had, because the government doesn't hesitate to do things in a dirty way. And we could have stopped it, but only if you speak as one committee, and we're not. See, I've always believed that it would be absolutely astounding if the Chief of the General Staff, having been in the Army for 43 years, the Chief of the Air Staff having been in the Air Force for 41 years, and the Chief of the Naval Staff having been in the Navy for even longer, because they started at the age of 13, could have the same perspective on any defence problems. I think it would be absolutely astounding if this was so, and I would actually tend to disbelieve it if they said it was so. I am a victim of the way I've been brought up. I believe very strongly that in terms of bang for buck, you get better value for money by investing money in the air, because it is flexible and pervasive. But the Chief of the Naval Staff doesn't agree with that. It would be surprising if he did. But a debate, I'm prepared to debate these points with my colleagues. And of course a decision's got to be taken in the long run, and decisions are made for many reasons, but what they should not be made for is a shortage of arguments on one side or the other. There will be a shortage of arguments in the future.
In the centre.
In the centre. And you'll get, we had it even in my time, the rather absurd, naive assertions of Central Staff officers, Army officers, telling us, for instance, what aircraft we should deploy to Cyprus to support the United Nations forces in the Lebanon. The man didn't know what he was talking about, but he had the authority to talk.
And he proposed?
He proposed sending Jaguars down there to support our United Nations troops, and it without asking me. And in a Chiefs of Staff meeting, he said, he was the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, and he said, I propose that we send a squadron of Jaguars to Cyprus. And I said, fine, well, what are they going to do? Are they going to support the United Nations forces? At the time, the Americans and the French were flying over Beirut, and their aircraft were required to have the ability to take out gun emplacements that were threatening United Nations forces. I said, well, how are you going to do that? We had only had, at that time, the Buccaneer Force that had airborne laser target marking. And unless the Jaguar Force would put somebody on the ground and go up into the hills at the back of the Lebanon and mark the target for us, we couldn't have guaranteed with any clinical precision, and of course we were worried about collateral damage. So, I mean, that was all right, I was able to stop it. But in future, Chief of the Air Staff...
Does not bode well.
Chief of the Air Staff may not be able to.
Can we look to the future in concluding this interview? Sir Keith, EFA appears to have got off the ground to a surprisingly good start. It was clearly one of the good pieces of news while you were Chief of the Air Staff. And that's despite the problems of foreign collaboration and subsequently, of course, the withdrawal of the French. Whether that is a problem or a positive advantage is debatable. A little bit on the inside story and whether you feel we're going the right way and we're going to get what we want?
Well, I'm absolutely sure we're going the right way. I mean, this was, I think, my major success in my time, because we got it off the ground, and we got it off the ground, I think, in a slightly devious but extremely profitable way. We got Michael Heseltine's great European, and we got him behind the idea of a European initiative to replace fighter aircraft, and it so happened that Germany, France, Italy, and ourselves, and subsequently Spain, all wanted a replacement in the right timescale, and that's square one for getting a collaborative venture going. And so we said, well, how about getting together and getting this off the ground? This was very attractive to the aircraft industries, of course, of Germany, France, and UK, and Italy to a certain extent, and there were minor, lesser players. And so we got the political enthusiasm for it, and then we had to get some agreement over the specifications of the aircraft that we wanted, and this raised very great difficulties. And it soon became clear that the French weren't about to agree with us. They were controlled almost entirely by Dassault. Marshal Dassault was still alive at that time, and Dassault had made a great living out of selling cheap light aircraft to third world countries, well, foreign countries, and he wanted us to have a cheap light fighter aircraft. Well, the intellectual arguments for that, apart from the fact that cheap and light will be cheaper, are unsustainable, because unless you have an aircraft that can actually compete with the opposition you're going to meet, there's simply no point in having lots of little ones. Otherwise, you might as well have tiger moths. So it was, but the French were the French. I much admire the way that the French industry, Air Force, and government all speak with one voice, and it wasn't about. They weren't about to change their minds. They wanted to dominate the program anyway, and so it was a great relief to me when they backed out. But we had a number of meetings in which we had to make sure that the Germans and the Italians and subsequently the Spaniards were on our side, kept on our side. And I have to say that the Italians were very staunch. They understand about flying. They're real professionals, and we had no difficulty with them. Germans, we had a bit initially, but subsequently they came firmly on our side, so the French backed out. And of course this is learning all the lessons of the Tornado program. We can never get involved in a major program of this size on our own, because come the next budget crisis, financial crisis, it'll be cancelled, as all they were, all through the 60s. But they'll have great difficulty in cancelling this one from within this country. They might get together and say it's not going to be worth the candle. And in drawing up the specifications, we said what we do not want is the F-18 invented in 1995. It must have a demonstrably better performance than the F-18. And all the detailed specifications were argued out internally around the table. I saw more charts than I know how to look at, and we won the day. Well, we all won the day in the end, and that is what the EFA is designed to do. It's good news for British industry, it's good news for European industry, it's good news for Europeanism, and it's very good news for the RAF. It's extremely bad news for the Army and Navy, unfortunately, because they see this great tranche of defence money being channeled into yet another Tornado program, which they will denigrate because it's unpleasant to them. I mean, they'll try to say that the Tornado is not worth the money that we paid on for it, because they're terrified that the EFA will mean that they will have to trim back. So it's a great, tactical achievement. I don't want to imply that I spent all my time trying to get one better than the Navy or the Army while I was up in Whitehall. But I have to say, that is a very, very important function of the Chief of the Air Staff. If the future of the Royal Air Force is to remain as bright as I think it is going to be as a result of that program. So I know my successor is continuing that momentum, and I understand within the very near future the memorandum of understanding is likely to be signed, and that's good news for us all.
Also, on that optimistic note, a fighter pilot talking about our future fighter aircraft, I would like to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to come and give us your reminiscences of your past. I'm sure this interview will serve future students at Bracknell very well indeed. Thank you very much indeed, sir.
It's been great fun. Thank you.